Troubleshooting Kerberos Constrained Delegation. Welcome to a short clip regarding Kerberos Constrained Delegation. If you have not done so already, I would recommend viewing the video on Troubleshooting Kerberos Delegation. This clip builds on the fundamentals of Kerberos Delegation. It is important to understand those fundamentals before moving on to Constrained Delegation. During this clip, we'll cover what Kerberos Constrained Delegation is, how it differs from simple delegation, and how to generally troubleshoot it. The intent of this clip is to provide you with a fundamental understanding of Kerberos Constrained Delegation. To start, let's go over some of the basic terminology. Delegation. Kerberos delegation is the ability to allow an application or service on a remote computer to do actions on behalf of the user, acting as that user. It is also known as open or simple delegation. For example, a client connects to a web server with Internet Explorer, and the web server impersonates that user and requests data from a SQL server on the user's behalf. In order to complete this action, the web server must impersonate the user and request a service ticket for the SQL server and provide it to the SQL server to gain access. Constrained delegation. Constrained delegation functions in the same manner as open delegation, but is restricted on where it can impersonate a user. In other words, the service is constrained to delegate only to certain services. This is a more secure method since it enacts the principle of least privilege. Protocol transition. Protocol transition is a feature that works with constrained delegation. It can allow the connection to the initial service to use an authentication method other than Kerberos. For example, the initial connection is authenticated using NTLM and transitioned to Kerberos for access to back-end resources. A cross-forest trust is a transitive trust between two forests, where forests are a collection of domains that share a configuration container and a schema. Kerberos authentication is fully supported intra-forest by default, but for Kerberos authentication to Windows domains outside of the forest, a cross-forest trust is necessary. Services for user is the collective term for the programmatic interface and behavior introduced in Windows Server 2003, which allows for protocol transition and constrained delegation. Services for user to self allows you to obtain a Windows token for the client by supplying a user principal name without a password. This is typically what is known as protocol transition. Services for user to proxy allows an administrator to control exactly which downstream services can be accessed using the S4U2Self token. This is what is otherwise known as constrained delegation. Spinago, a standard for embedding authentication negotiation into network traffic. Generally speaking, this traffic allows clients and servers to negotiate the best available authentication method that both the client and server support or require. The SSPI is characterized as a layer of Windows code that allows developers to add authentication into their projects. This code is published publicly in the Windows Software Development Kit. We'll talk a little more on these interfaces later in the presentation. Constrained delegation is configured in the same area as open or simple delegation. This screenshot shows the delegation tab on user or computer objects that have service principal names added to them. The first option is do not trust this user for delegation. Having this radio button selected will disallow delegation for any service that runs under this account. The second option is trust this user for delegation to any service, Kerberos only. Selecting this radio button will configure the account for open delegation. It allows any service that runs under this account to impersonate any users that authenticate to it on any other service. You can restrict this by marking certain user accounts as sensitive. This blocks all impersonation attempts for that account. It is a good security practice to use open delegation for testing purposes, but to move to constrained delegation after this testing is complete. The third option is trust this user for delegation to specified services only. Selecting this radio button will configure the account for constrained delegation. When you select this option, more configuration options are available. The first set is a choice between Use Kerberos Only and Use Any Authentication Protocol. By default, Use Kerberos Only is selected. If you wish to use Protocol Transition, select the Use Any Authentication Protocol radio button. When selecting Constrained Delegation, you must specify which services this account can present delegated credentials. You can select these by clicking the Add button, selecting the account the service runs under, then select the service. You can remove services by highlighting them and clicking the Remove button. Now we understand how to configure Constrained Delegation. There will be times that delegation fails, and it is important to understand how to troubleshoot this. The first step in troubleshooting Kerberos delegation issues is understanding the infrastructure. You need to know who the user is, where they first connect, and where they are being delegated to. Once you understand the basics, you will know how it should be configured to function properly. If we know who the user is, we can check to ensure they are not marked as a sensitive account. If we know where the user makes the initial connection, we can find what service account is being used. Once we know that, we can check to ensure that the account is trusted for delegation, it has permissions to delegate to all related services, and that any SPNs for that service are registered properly. If we know where they are being delegated to, we can check those service accounts to ensure SPNs are registered properly as well. Network captures help tell the story of what is working and what isn't working. With Constrained Delegation, we may notice a KDC bad option error. This indicates there was a request for a delegated ticket, but it was not allowed. Finally, let's go over some of the common problems that cause Kerberos delegation to fail. First, the SPNs for the services are not registered. Without the SPNs, Kerberos will fail. Second, the SPNs are registered incorrectly. This can include registering the SPN to the wrong account or registering the SPN on more than one account. Third, the service account is not trusted for delegation. Check the Delegation tab for the service account and ensure the proper delegation settings are in place. Check to see if the service account is set up for open delegation or constrained delegation. If it is set up for constrained delegation, ensure the proper SPNs are listed that it may delegate to. If you are unsure of the proper settings, try setting it for open delegation first. Once that works, then try configuring constrained delegation. Finally, the user's account is marked as sensitive. If the user's account is marked as sensitive, it cannot be delegated to any service. Thank you for your time. I hope this was informative.